Chapter 6. The Argument from Heredity. Having failed to find either facts, phenomena, or valid reasons for the assumptions of atheism in regard to the origin of life, let us briefly examine the question from the theistic point of view, and see what facts there are to sustain the belief that the stream of life and mind has a source higher than the insensate earth. In making this inquiry, I shall continue to be guided by facts as they appear in the history of evolution, and I shall draw upon the same sources of information that I have thus far drawn upon, namely, the great masters of biological science. I shall also be guided very largely by their general conclusions. In fact, I shall carry those conclusions further than they have carried them, but I shall not deviate from the line of direction which they have indicated. The particular doctrine to which I shall first invite attention is that of heredity. Heredity, in a general sense, is defined as the transmission of physical or mental peculiarities, qualities, etc., from parent to offspring. In the biological sense, it is defined as the tendency manifested by one organism to develop in the likeness of a progenitor. These are general definitions with which everybody is familiar. The doctrine as applied to biogeny, however, requires a more specific statement. In the language of Darwin, it is that all the innumerable species, genera, and families of organic beings with which the world is peopled have all descended, each within its own class or group, from common parents. 2. And, in view of the facts of geology, it follows that all living plants and animals are the lineal descendants of those which lived long before the Silurian epoch. It is an obvious consequence of this theory of descent, says Huxley, that all plants and animals, however different they may now be, must, at one time or other, have been connected by direct or indirect intermediate gradations, and that the appearance of isolation presented by various groups of organic beings must be unreal. More specifically still, Professor Haeckel, as we have already seen, emphasizes the doctrine of heredity and traces the line of descent back through 22 gradients. From man to the Monera. 4 that Haeckel is a standard authority among atheistic evolutionists is a matter of current knowledge among scientific men everywhere. Darwin himself takes particular pains to endorse his views in general and in particular. Speaking of one of Professor Haeckel's works on the genealogy of man, Mr. Darwin has this to say: "If this work had appeared before my essay had been written, I should probably never have completed it. Most all the conclusions at which I have arrived I find confirmed by this naturalist, whose knowledge on many points is much fuller than mine." It will thus be seen that if there is any one point upon which the masterminds of biogenetic science are in complete harmony, it is in subscribing to the proposition that man inherited his faculties from the lower animals, beginning with the lowest form of animal life, the Monera. A corollary of this, to which they all subscribe, is that the potentialities of manhood reside in the lowest form of animal life. Now, it is not too much to say that this conclusion is the most important result of the study of the facts of organic evolution. From every point of view, it is the grand result, for everything else of importance is included, and atheistic and theistic evolutionists can meet on this common ground, not of belief, but of knowledge. It matters not how devious or divergent the paths by which they have reached the goal, science and religion have at last found a basis of at least temporary reconciliation. It is obvious that it must have been a potent agency that was capable of bringing atheism and theism into harmonious relations. That agency could have been nothing less potent than truth. And the process by which that truth was reached was that of inductive reasoning, reasoning from the observable facts and phenomena of nature. It was thus that atheism and theism alike discovered that there is not one fact in nature that points to any other possible means of acquiring mental faculties than that of inheritance. Now, let us see what is necessarily presupposed in the doctrine of heredity. First, then, it presupposes something to inherit, and secondly, it presupposes an ancestor from which that something is inherited. Obviously, nothing can be inherited that does not exist, actually or potentially, and nothing can be inherited unless there is an existent entity from which to derive the inheritance. These are self-evident propositions, and they may be reduced to one fundamental proposition as follows. An inherited faculty presupposes an antecedent entity endowed with a mind in which the identical faculty actually or potentially exists. The faculty may be different in degree, but not in kind. It may be greater or smaller, as phenomenally manifested in the offspring, than it was in the parent, but it must be identical in kind. Thus, A child may exhibit wonderful faculties in which the parent may seem totally deficient, but it is self-evident that the same faculties existed potentially in the parent. On the other hand, the parent may have faculties largely developed in which the child may seem totally deficient, but that they exist potentially in the child is a proposition that no sane person can or will gainsay. These are elementary principles in the doctrine of heredity, and that they apply with equal force to the phylogenetic series, from the monoran to man, is the elementary proposition of the theory of evolution. Eliminate them from the doctrine of evolution, and the whole fabric falls to pieces of its own weight. If the doctrine of heredity fails, then fails the whole theory of progressive development of animal life, and the world is again plunged into the dark and dismal realms of superstition. Now, let us apply the doctrine of heredity to the solution of the question of the origin of life. In other words, let us carry the principle of heredity to its legitimate conclusion. In doing so, we will bear in mind the promise not to deviate one hair's breadth from the line of direction which atheism has indicated as the one leading to ultimate truth, that is, to the ultimate solution of the problem of the origin of life and mind on this planet. Beginning with man, therefore, and going back through the phylogenetic series to the monoran, atheism and theism will travel along harmoniously together, each subscribing to the propositions, I, that all faculties of mind are acquired by inheritance, and 2, that an inherited faculty presupposes an antecedent entity endowed with a mind in which the identical faculty actually or potentially exists. When the monoran is reached, however, the atheist pauses and protests against going any further in that particular direction. He has discovered what no scientist has ever found before, and what none but an atheistic scientist is capable of discovering, namely, an exception to a law of nature. The law of heredity is no longer suited to his purpose. It works the wrong way. Its implications are no longer atheistic, and he abandons it forever. The theistic evolutionist, on the other hand, finds in the monoran no exception to any law of nature with which he is acquainted. On the contrary, he finds in that little animal confirmation strong as proofs of Holy Writ that the law of heredity holds as good at the beginning of organic life as it does at every subsequent stage. That is to say, he sees the same necessity for the presupposition of a mind antecedent to the monoran, a mind endowed with the same attributes and powers, differing only in degree, that he finds inherent in that lowest form of animal life. Now, let us examine a little more systematically the logical attitude, respectively, of the atheistic and the theistic evolutionist, in regard to this the most important question raised by the facts of organic evolution. It must be remembered, to begin with, that each of the two contending parties professes to be conducting the examination by the process of induction. Each professes to ignore all speculative philosophy bearing upon the subject, and to be guided solely by the facts and observable phenomena. And each has recognized the fact that it is at the very beginning of organic life in this world that we must find, if anywhere, tangible evidences as to its origin. This is in accordance with the elementary principle of all processes of rational investigation. It is recognized by every true scientist who seeks to interpret correctly the laws of nature. It is recognized by every lawyer who seeks to interpret the statutes of his country. Blackstone lays particular stress upon this principle as the only infallible guide to the correct interpretation of ambiguous statutes. If the words are ambiguous, says this greatest of English law writers, I quote from memory, examine the context, and then the subject matter. If it is still ambiguous, consider the reason and spirit of the law. In doing the latter, he lays down this simple rule. Consider the old law, the mischief, and the remedy. That is to say, first find what the old law was. Secondly, what was the mischief or evil in the old law that required a remedy? And thirdly, what was the remedy devised by the new law? In other words, we must go back to the very beginning if we would find facts that will enable us to interpret correctly a law either of God or of man. It is this principle that every true lawyer applies to the whole system of jurisprudence under which he practices. It is this principle that every true scientist applies to the investigation of every problem of nature. It is this principle that I have sought to apply to the investigation of the question, what is the origin of life on this planet? I repeat, therefore, that if there are existent facts that bear directly upon the question of the origin of life, we must look for them at the beginning of life. We will now group the facts and arguments bearing upon this question in the following order. I. The issue between atheism and theism. 2. The facts agreed upon. 3. The facts in support of atheism. 4. The facts in support of theism. The issue between the atheistic and the theistic evolutionist is this. The former holds that life and mind originated by spontaneous generation from inorganic matter. The latter holds that life and mind were acquired by inheritance from an omniscient mind. The facts and principles tacitly agreed upon by both parties are substantially the following. First, that in the mind of the moneron reside the potentialities of the mental faculties of manhood. Secondly, that in the phylogenetic history of organic life there is no instance of the acquisition of mental faculties in any other way than by inheritance. Thirdly, that an inherited faculty necessarily presupposes an antecedent intelligence identical in kind. Fourthly, that all experimental attempts to generate organic life from inorganic compounds have utterly failed. Fifthly, that the moneron consists of a mass of absolutely undifferentiated, structureless plastin or primitive slime. Sixthly, that it is, nevertheless, endowed with a mind organism, and that it performs all the functions and exhibits all the essential phenomena of organic life, namely, sensation, movement, nutrition, and reproduction. All this being antecedent to, and independent of, reason, experience, or instruction. Seventhly, that this mental energy thus resident within the moneron is the power which caused its own development from an undifferentiated mass of plastin to the differentiated or nucleated amoeba, thus taking the first forward step in the process of organic evolution. Eighthly, that the mind of the moneron antedated its physical organism and was, as a matter of fact, the antecedent cause of physical organism. These are facts which will not be denied by either atheist or theist. They are either specifically or tacitly affirmed by both, and they are essential to both, paradoxical as it may seem. They are essential to the atheistic evolutionist because they are essential to the general hypothesis of evolution. They are essential to the theistic evolutionist for the same reason, and also because they are essential to the hypothesis of theism. It is now in order to inquire what facts there are to sustain the theory of spontaneous generation. The reader has already anticipated the answer. There is not one fact that points in that direction. This I have hereinbefore pointed out and emphasized by quotations from Professor Haeckel's works, in which he confesses that the theory cannot be verified, but consoles himself by the declaration that it cannot be disproved. All experimental failures to develop or generate organic life from inorganic matter count for nothing in his mind. Candor compels the admission that it is not the best quality of evidence. It is always difficult and often impossible to prove a negative. But it must also be remembered that, logically, no one is bound to prove a negative until the side holding the affirmative has made at least a prima facie case. In this instance, not only has this not been done, but confessedly it cannot be done. The evidence for spontaneous generation, therefore, may be set down as absolutely less than no evidence at all, for the only facts bearing upon the case are against the hypothesis. I submit, therefore, that, considered as a scientific conclusion based upon inductive processes of reasoning, the hypothesis of spontaneous generation is simply a logical absurdity. Induction presupposes at least one fact, the argument from heredity. 305 pointing in the direction indicated by the hypothetical conclusion. Moreover, an axiom recognized by every logician and by every scientist worthy of the name is that, if a hypothesis is not sustained by all the facts bearing upon the question, it is necessarily wrong. This axiom is founded upon two fundamental truths, namely, 1. That no fact in all this universe is inconsistent with any other fact, and 2. There are no exceptional cases in the operation of nature's laws. These may all be condensed into that most fundamental and important of all scientific truths, namely, that which is affirmative of the constancy of nature. The hypothesis of spontaneous generation is, therefore, an absolute and unqualified derogation of each and all of these fundamental axioms. Considered, therefore, as a proposition emanating from a body of scientists who are constantly proclaiming their devotion to the principles of induction, it must be considered unique, to say the least. 4. If it has ever been paralleled for bald assumption without the shadow of a shade of evidence, history has not recorded the fact. Now, there must have existed some overwhelming logical necessity for such a flagrant violation of all the principles that are supposed to prevail in the scientific investigation of the phenomena of nature. It will be recalled that Professor Haeckel confessed that the hypothesis of spontaneous generation was a mere assumption and that it was prompted by necessity. A few words will explain this necessity and how it arose. It will be remembered that, when the doctrine of organic evolution was first promulgated, it was regarded as an atheistic science. It was natural that it should be so regarded, since it was promulgated by atheists, but especially for the reason that the theory substituted progressive development for the old doctrine of special creations of genera and species in the organic world. Having succeeded in disproving the latter doctrine, the atheistic scientists imagined that they had eliminated God from the universe, that is to say, having discovered proximate causes for a great many phenomena which had before been supposed to be due to miraculous intervention, they jumped to the conclusion that there was no necessity for final or purposive causes for anything. Hence they determined either to find a mechanical cause, Haeckel, for every phenomenon or invent one out of hand. Heredity served their purpose admirably until they reached the very beginning of animal life. Here was the crucial point, the parting of the ways. If they carried the doctrine of heredity to its legitimate conclusion, it presupposed an intelligence antecedent to the Mon-era, and that intelligence, of course, could be none other than that of omniscience. But as that did not comport with their predetermined atheism, they had no other resource but to invent. And so they invented. They invented a theory of the origin of life and mind on this planet. The invention may have been original with them, but it was not new, for it had been exactly paralleled by the late lamented Thomson. The most important part of Professor Haeckel's remarks on this subject consists of the confession which he inadvertently makes when he sets forth the dire consequences of refusing to accept the theory of spontaneous generation. He who does not accept that theory has no other resource but to believe in a supernatural miracle, are the portentous words of the great atheist. Considered as an atheistic proselyting agency among the feeble-minded, these words are potent, as I have already shown. Considered as a statement of fact, they are untrue, as I have hereinbefore pointed out, for a miracle cannot be predicated of an event occurring in its natural order. But, considered as a scientific declaration of the narrow limits of the field of inquiry for causation, they are profoundly significant. It is equivalent to saying, there are but two possible theories of causation. One is spontaneous generation, and the other is divine agency. The value of this declaration consists in its obvious and undeniable truth. The ingenuity of man is not equal to the formulation of any other rational hypothesis to account for the origin of life on this planet. One of these hypotheses is true, and the other is false. There is, and there can be, no middle ground. Either positively excludes the other, for they are antithetical. This declaration by Professor Haeckel is the exact equivalent, in its implications, of what I have been contending for all along. It is a declaration that if the question of theism or anti-theism is ever to be settled by induction, it must be done at this point, the beginning of organic life. In the meantime, or until the question is settled at this point, all other questions pertaining to the subject matter are purely subsidiary, incidental, and speculative. I must not, however, be understood as admitting that, even if it could be demonstrated that organic life could be generated from inorganic compounds, the existence of an intelligent great first cause of all things would thereby be disproved. On the contrary, the old arguments for the existence of such a deity would not be diminished in value in the least. It would simply be putting that question one step farther back, but otherwise leaving it just where it was found, in the domain of speculative philosophy. On the other hand, if an inductive examination of the question reveals the great first cause in the lowest form of animal life, that is to say, if the facts admit of no other possible interpretation, then every teleological argument that has ever been made is invested with a scientific value and significance that it never before possessed. In the meantime, I am not unaware of one logical advantage possessed by the other side in the discussion of this question. I am fully impressed with the value of the scientific axiom that we have neither occasion nor logical right to ascribe any phenomenon to supramundane agency so long as it can be explained under principles of natural law with which we are acquainted. In my former works, when I have strenuously insisted upon the never-failing value of this axiom, and I have taken occasion to apply it to the phenomena of so-called spiritism. And I have undertaken to show that the fatal weakness of spiritism consists in the fact that all its phenomena are easily explicable under natural laws, the existence of which the spiritists do not themselves deny. I just as strenuously insist upon the application of this rule to the subject under present consideration. But I also claim the right to trace to a supramundane source any phenomena that admittedly cannot be explained by reference to any known law, and, a fortiori, I claim that right in cases where all the known facts conspire to disprove the only possible hypothesis under which the necessity for a supramundane explanation could be avoided. I admit that it requires a very strong array of reasons to justify a scientist in seeking in supramundane realms for an explanation of phenomena in the organic world. But it demands still stronger reasons to justify him in ignoring facts, belittling their importance, or misrepresenting their significance when conducting an inductive inquiry. Still stronger reasons are required to justify a scientist in postulating a theory of causation that is destitute of either fact or reason to support it. And nothing can justify him in belittling the intelligence of possible opponents by charging them in advance with gross superstition. Having now definitely ascertained that there are neither facts nor reasons to sustain the theory of spontaneous generation, let us next in order inquire what facts there are to warrant the acceptance of the hypothesis of hereditary transmission from an antecedent mind.